And when he takes an objective analysis of what happened in this situation, he realizes that, hey, we've got an account manager here that's got over 30 accounts, and one of them is the biggest account, which is Uber, and they're managing all of this. So yeah, it's no wonder that they're doing too much. They've got too much on their plate, and they're not able to service Uber effectively, and that's why we actually lost some of their business. And so then he said, I don't need to fire anyone. I need to hire more people instead. And so then they hired more account managers. They were able to bounce back, and in a short time, they were able to grow their company 5 times the size that it was before that.
You are now listening to the podcast where authors inspire listeners to become authors, the Going North Podcast. I'm your host, certified self-leadership trainer, best-selling author, and book enthusiast, Dom Brightman. And you're going to be listening to a different author that will inspire you to join the business of immortality, known as authorship. Now let the fun begin. Today's episode is sponsored by both books, Going North, Tips and Techniques to Advance Yourself, and the follow-up bestseller, Stay the Course, The Elite Performer's 7 Secret Keys to Sustainable Success. Head over to Amazon.com, pick up both books. They are available in a trifecta of paperback, audio, and ebook. Cop all 3 of both and be on the lookout for another book from yours truly to help podcasters succeed. Now let's get on with today's episode. And today on the Highlight Reel Builder for Authors, known as the Going North Podcast, we got another super special, awesome human for you today, courtesy of one of the best sites ever on earth, known as podmatch.com. One of the site with podcast guests get to connect with podcast hosts. And if they're cool, they're freaking in. And today's guest is cooler than 2 cucumbers indeed, because today's preaching author, y'all, that's right indeed. My man is a husband, a father of 3, business consultant, as well as an award-winning marketer. Like, we rarely have one of those award-winning marketers on the show. So man knows what the heck he's doing. And he's the principal partner, the double P at the People Branch. Let's give it up for the one and only Dustin Staiger. How you doing today, Dustin?
I'm doing great, Dom. How are you doing?
Doing good. All introductions are not allowed to be 38 years, 0.5 days long. It probably only covered, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes of it. So mine, filling in any cavities I may have missed about you, my man, and helps you to become the Dustin that you are today.
Yeah, I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and I've always been somewhat of an artist growing up. My relatives, when I'd come visit, they'd always keep pen and paper nearby, pads of paper, pencils, a little drawer that I'd go to and pull things out and start drawing, and just was always known for that growing up, and always had a creative bent to me. And I carried that throughout my high school years and into college. Studied art in college and came out as a graphic designer and illustrator, and pursued that career for many years. And we've always geared toward creative roles in organizations, and worked as a graphic designer, worked as an illustrator, illustrated magazines and books, and then worked into advertising, worked my way up to become a creative director in an ad agency, and then worked multiple marketing roles along the way, and became an owner of a marketing agency, and did some consulting within the oil and gas industry. It wasn't necessarily the most creative work that I could be doing, but did work on the BP oil spill, helped with the communication side, internal communications, working with the lead engineering team. Got to see some amazing things happening. I tell people it was like being at mission control during Apollo 13, seeing them, figuring out how they could take what they had on hand to be able to do something that they've never done before, basically, and to take what they were doing, what they're trying to do, and help them communicate that to the executive team at BP, to the government agencies that were involved as well. And that included creating communication decks that then would go on to even to the president, where we were told, I was working on a communication deck at one time. They're like, this is going to go to President Obama. Basically, he's going to read through this. So helping them take an idea, concepts that they're doing, visuals with that, and combine all that into a message that they could present to these different stakeholders during a time of a crisis. And so took that and then moved into a role where I was actually working with ConocoPhillips, another large oil and gas company, on how they could take their people and help them understand what their competencies were and to help kind of fill the gaps where their competencies weren't up to speed. And it was called a competency management program. And so a lot of this sounds like it's, getting away from a lot of things I did before, but there's this whole communications piece to it that I worked on, but also understanding that corporate culture at the time as well. And how does that come into play? And at the same time, seeing these instances where you've got companies that are, dealing with a crisis, and you've got companies that are trying to prevent a crisis, how they're managing their culture at this time in a situation where blame is very heavy, right? So that's something that would come back later on to influence me, and something that I used whenever I wrote my book later on about that topic, about blame, called Blame This Book. But then after leaving that role within the oil and gas industry, went back into marketing and worked within commercial interiors. And so, office furniture, modular walls, flooring, all that kind of stuff, the interior space, the interior architecture of these companies, and learning how companies like we partnered with Steelcase, which was, they're the largest global leader in office furniture. And they had a whole research arm to them where they worked on helping companies understand how their environment impacted, the physical environment that they created impacted the productivity and the creativity and the innovation that their employers were able to bring to the work that they were doing at that time, and how that impacted their culture. And I found that just fascinating at the time, and just dove into the research that they had on that. And so later on, as I'm looking at, okay, I see this thread throughout my career, and working and being creative, and just fascinated with how can companies improve the creativity that their organization has, how can they help foster a more creative work culture, and then also looking at what are employees struggling with, and how many employees feel like they can't bring their entire selves to the work that they're doing, and seeing the research behind all of this, where they're saying that employees, that the engagement, Gallup does these surveys each year about employee engagement globally, and looking at that and seeing that they're saying that globally, if you have 1/3 of your workforce engaged in their work, then you're doing well. That actually is, meeting the standard right now. That's probably about average globally, that 1 out of every 3 workers is actually engaged in the work that they're doing. And seeing that statistic, that shocked me. And I've watched it for years, and it really hasn't moved. And it's been that consistent number. And so when you think about that, that means 1 out of 3 is engaged. That means 2 out of 3 is not engaged. And so you've got twice as many people in the workforce who aren't engaged in what they're doing. And there's even 1/3 of that group that is considered actively disengaged. And they're typically working against they're not just disengaged in what the company is trying to accomplish, they're actively working against what the company is trying to do. And so you see 2 sides of that coin, where it's like, well, that's a huge problem for leaders. How can they get people to be more engaged in the work that they're doing? How can they keep 1/3 of their workforce from sabotaging what they're trying to accomplish? Right? That's sad, and so to me, it's like, that shouldn't be the standard. 1/3 cannot be the standard. What can we do to fix that? And then on the other side of the coin, it's, what is happening on the employee side that is causing them to be disengaged? Why aren't people feeling fulfilled in the work that they're doing? Why aren't they able to bring their passion to their work? Why aren't they able to, bring all of their ability and feel like they're finding fulfillment and they're finding purpose in the work that they're doing, and that they are an integral part of the success of their company, and that their company is behind them in helping them be successful as well. And so there's that gap. It just, to me, is like, okay, both sides of this chasm, the leaders and the employees are trying to accomplish something very similar. Neither one of them want that statistic to be true. Both of them would love to see the workplace become more engaging. Why isn't that happening? And as I delved into it, looking at it, okay, so there's something that's holding people back. There's something that's keeping them from being able to, fully engage in that work. And the cliche answer is that there's fear, that people are afraid of something. That fear is keeping them from being able to, take a leap, to take a risk, right? And then you look at that as like, well, there's got to be something more to that. And it's okay, so that's fear of failure is what keeps them from taking that risk. Because if you don't want to risk something when you think it might fail, it's like, well, okay, but then when you look at these different organizations, there's some organizations, it's not that they keep people from failing, they embrace that failure in some way. And so how are they able to overcome that fear of failure? What is it? And when I looked at it, and when I study what researchers have shown us, it's that it's not just fear, it's not just fear of failure, it's the blame that happens afterwards, right? That it's okay to be afraid, it's okay to fail. And as long as you're not then following up that failure with assigning blame, with scapegoating people, with using it against them and harming them because they took a risk and because they failed.
So I'm talking about it, dude. Yeah, like the thing is, like, yeah, fear holds people back, but also it's the aftermath too that folks are probably fearing more. So, oh yeah, it's fear, failure, fear, success. Both can be scary, but it's like, oh man, but they blame you for everything, and it's like, oh hey, they work, through the blame of that. Oh, hey, that's what beat all right. And heck, I guess that was a trial by fire. I guess, and kind of like for better word, especially having the head of the BP oil spill. Because that was huge years ago. Man,
Yes.
definitely huge. Like having to tackle all that because folks were.
Right. Right. Yeah. So then, that kind of brought me, where I'm at today. And so I said, hey, this is something that so many companies are struggling with, and it's a global phenomenon. So then I took that message and I said, okay, I'm going to build this out. And how can I, communicate this in a way that's going to help both the employees, the individuals, and the leaders in these workplaces as well, to help them overcome that fear of failure and the blame that's associated with it. And when looking at that more specifically, started to understand that, hey, this is something that it's global because it's pretty much a universal issue, right? We all have that blame habit within us. And so and an example of that is when you look at the creation story, right? That is in the Judeo-Christian Bible, it's in the Muslim Quran, it's in the Jewish Torah, the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve. And pretty much all of us have heard this story and we understand it, and we focus on the thing that, there's the first two people in all of creation, and they're in relationship with God, and they're in the garden, and God says, you can partake of any of the fruits, everything is good except for this one tree. Don't eat the fruit from this one tree, right? And of course, what do? They eat the fruit from that tree. And then God confronts them and says, why did you do this? And Adam then says, oh my gosh, you know what? I really messed up. I realize I made a mistake, and I'm going to take ownership of that mistake, right? No, he doesn't do that.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And so you see that, and then he says, okay, who's the only other person here? I'm going to blame Eve, right? So then he blames her, and she takes ownership of it at that point. She admits her mistake, right? No, she doesn't. They got the only two people in all of creation, and both of them try to pass off the blame, and she's got nobody else to blame, so she blames the snake instead of taking accountability and responsibility herself. And Adam does the same thing. And so we focus on that they ate from the fruit of the forbidden tree, but What I wonder is that original sin, or really is the original sin that they decided to blame somebody else in that moment, right? They tried to shift the blame elsewhere at that moment instead of taking responsibility. And so that's something that, between those three religions that I listed that have this creation story as, the center of their faith, that's over 50% of the population of the earth follows one of those three religions. So you've got a majority of the people in the world that this is, a core creation story for, their faith. Why is that? And so I really believe it's because that blame habit is in each and every one of us, and it's something that every one of us struggle with. So to me, it's a universal issue, and it's something that we really need to address. And I don't know if you've noticed, Dom, but I feel like it feels like it's becoming, more and more exacerbated as the years go on. Through social media, through TV, through politics. Just everything that you see people struggling with. It feels like that blame habit and the blame culture, and what you're seeing in workplaces, what we're seeing, at parent teacher conferences and school board meetings, and what we're seeing, in our state capitals and in our, US Capitol, what's happening, that all of these things, and you're seeing it on, cable news stations, and you're seeing it in your Facebook feed everywhere, is that blame is just rampant. It's more rampant than it ever has been, in my opinion.
Just say that again, and heck, even funny enough, I guess with all of that, is that the reason why you took the kind of fun approach with that's out of your book, blame this book? Yes, so folks have something to blame.
Yeah, so yeah, a lot of people are like, okay, what, that's interesting, why, what does that mean, and so basically the idea is that, when you see all these people, and then when there's a failure within an organization, they're looking for somebody to blame. And like you said, there's, that we talked about, it's a global issue, and so you see that it is inherent in us. And so if we're going to have, it's kind of like, so I took an analogy of, somebody that's running a marathon. They say that when you run a marathon, you really can't avoid getting tired. So what successful marathon runners do is they have a place to put the tired, right? And so they say, okay, I'm going to take that. I'm going to, some of them will even say, like as a metaphor, I'm going to put it in my pocket, right? So I know I'm going to get tired. Oh, I feel that tiredness. I'm going to take the tiredness. I'm not going to ignore it, but I'm just going to stick it in my pocket. I got a place to put it. And so, it's kind of the same thing with blame. It's one of those things where after a failure, there's this tension that builds up. There's this pressure. You feel that you need to blame someone, blame something. And I'm saying, hey, don't blame somebody else. Also, equally, don't blame yourself. But you need something to blame. Okay, if you need something to blame, then blame this book, right? It's kind of like sticking the tired in your pocket. Hey, it gives you something to blame. And some people are like, okay, it's kind of silly that I'm blaming this book. Well, does it make any more sense to blame an innocent person in that situation? And the thing is that when I talk to leaders, they feel like they have to find somebody to blame. They have to use that blame in order to create accountability. And I help explain it to them. It's like, no, that's not what you need to do. And in fact, we need, if you're talking about responsibility and accountability, that's great. We need to, hold people accountable. We need to uphold responsibility, and we need to be responsible ourselves. But those are completely different terms. And so blame is not equal to responsibility. Blame is not equal to accountability. It actually gets in the way of those things. So I help leaders by helping them understand, what is blame in the first place. It's something that we throw around a lot, and we talk about it, and we feel like we need it, but we don't even understand what it actually is. And so the definition that I like to use is, I tell them that blame is resentment that we feel toward someone or something that we hold at fault for a misfortune. And that's a little bit wordy. So if you want to shorten that down and simplify it, you can just say blame is resentment, basically. And so when you understand that, you're not going to say, well, but I need that. What do I do without that? You're not saying, oh, well, how do I hold people accountable without resentment? Then you don't need it. It's not helpful, actually. It's not, not only is it not helpful, it actually will create, it'll actually harm your relationships and it'll actually harm your culture. So then you look at, okay, so responsibility, that's just taking ownership, right? That's saying, hey, whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm saying, what I'm saying right now, the words that are coming out of my mouth right now, I am responsible for those things. If I misspeak, then I will take ownership of that, right? And then I give you the right to hold me accountable for that. And that's what accountability is giving others authority to make sure that you're acting responsible, right? That you're acting responsibly in a situation. So they're knowing that, hey, I'm going to submit myself to the consequences for my actions, basically. That's accountability, right? So then you see blame, responsibility, accountability. These are three different things. And so you don't need blame. It's not helpful. And it actually gets in the way of us being able to hold people accountable and us actually being responsible because all that blame is resentment.
So I'm talking about indeed. And funny enough, as you give that definition of accountability, it kind of feels like sometimes folks may feel like, hey, you know what? Let's make them take accountability. Let's blame for this thing and try to out them and oust them. Some folks kind of go too far. It's like, just try to cancel somebody. It's like, that's probably something totally out there for when it comes to just to the workplace. Because usually that, well, then again, it goes that. It's just not like public, like
Right.
publicly. It's like forever. It's just, oh, you piss off a couple folks and you leave the company, go to another one, you start your business or whatever. As opposed to online where it's like, oh, someone might save a tweet or a post or whatever. But yeah, it's definitely good that you're doing this too, with like helping folks to really focus on having that self accountability and helping others to give them that authority to make sure you really keep your word. To be honest, it's really just about doing what you say you're going to do. To be honest, is if only it was that simple, right? Just stick to that.
Right. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, and so one of the examples that I use in the book is a company called Twilio, and so that they create tools for software developers, and they're doing really well. Their CEO Jeff Lawson, he gets informed that Uber had informed them that their largest client at the time is Uber, and Uber calls up and says, "Hey, we have to scale back dramatically on how much that we're using you guys for." And so it was so much, in fact, that when Twilio revealed this, then their stock market price dropped 40% in one day. So it's a huge impact, right? And so as a leader, you feel like, oh my gosh, this is a crisis moment, something horrible has happened. I have to take action. And Lawson was, looking at it, and his knee-jerk reaction was, I need to fire whoever is in charge of the Uber account, right? And then he stopped himself and he was like, wait a second. Okay, let's just put the brakes on. Let's take a look at what happened in this situation before we make any decisions to take action, right? And you think, okay, well, that's common sense. But there's a lot of leaders that would not do that. And he does. And when he takes an objective analysis of what happened in this situation, he realizes that, hey, we've got an account manager here that's got over 30 accounts, and one of them is the biggest account, which is Uber, and they're managing all of this. So yeah, it's no wonder that they're doing too much. They've got too much on their plate, and they're not able to service Uber effectively, and that's why we actually lost some of their business. And so then he said, I don't need to fire anyone. I need to hire more people instead. And so then they hired more account managers, and then in the process, they were able to, even though Uber had scaled back, they were able to bounce back. And in a short time, they were able to grow their company 5 times the size that it was before that. And so he said that he gives a lot of credit to what he then called blameless postmortems. And so being able to look at what actually happened in a mistake or a failure objectively and analyze it and find out what the root cause of that failure was before they would actually take any action, and to do it without blaming anyone. And he was able to grow his company, 5 times its previous size because of that. And so when you look at that, leaders, they're in that situation and they have a choice to make. And Lawson in that situation felt the pressure of, I've got to uh, take decisive action here. And but you have to ask the question: am I taking action that is going to solve the problem that created this issue, or am I simply taking action in order to relieve the pressure, right, of the situation? And if you're just relieving the pressure, then you're actually creating a situation where you may create more problems in the future. And especially if you're scapegoating or if you're just blaming somebody in that situation, you may, and you're not analyzing objectively what happened, then you could be taking an innocent person and putting the blame on them. And that's what he would have been doing in that situation with that Uber account manager, that someone that they actually put in an unfair situation. He would have been blaming them, firing them, and then down the road, they probably would have had another account grow. Maybe they grow the Uber account back up again, and then they have the same issue happen again, and they lose business again because they never solved that root problem in the situation. And that's where blame gets in the way of us. It actually is, I call it a pseudo solution, but it also is a distraction from the solution as well, because we think we found a solution by firing somebody or just blaming someone, but it keeps us from actually finding the true solution in that issue.
Pseudo solution. I freaking love it. Just right. That's right. That's freaking good right there. It's like, let's throw a band-aid on it. It's like, it's just a pseudo solution. Let's
Right.
have y'all think it's a solution. It's a veneer. Don't worry, y'all. The grass is green. It's not brown. Don't worry, the meteor's not coming. Don't worry. It's just a heat wave. It'll be fine. It'll be
Right.
good.
Yeah. We fool ourselves all the time, right?
Don't worry, we got some sand over here next to the grass for some strange reason. Let's all stick our heads in it.
Exactly. Yeah, and it is kind of a stick your head in the sand kind of situation, and you hope that it gets better. And there's companies like Handy Dan and the two executives in that company, that their business got bought up by a venture capital firm, and the owner of that venture capital firm ended up, after a period of time, he was known for being very volatile and firing previous executives and everything. But these two guys thought that they were safe in this situation, and eventually they kind of had some disagreements with the venture capitalist, and then they ended up getting fired. And in that situation, they got blamed. They were saying there's some things that they did that were inappropriate or whatever, and so there are false claims that were thrown around. And so these two guys then leave that company, and they start their own home improvement business. They move away from Handy Dan and they move on and do their own, and they started a small little company called Home Depot. Right. So which one of these companies is still in existence today, right? Home Depot. Handy Dan went out of business in the 80s. Home Depot now just, is going like gangbusters and is, a global phenomenon, hugely successful. And so that's a situation where someone, it shot them in the foot because they took two people that were, very valuable to the organization, and in a situation where a leader let their ego get in the way and decided, hey, I'm going to blame someone, I'm going to put it on them, get rid of them, and then I'll be able to do what I want to in this situation. But it ends up backfiring on them instead. And so, two things from that situation is that, hey, you can see that how blame can be something that if you wield it as a leader, it can actually damage you in those situations. And then the other thing is that you've got, those two executives, if they had taken ownership of that blame and said, if they have taken, allowed themselves to identify with that blame, and, if they had seen that as something that is reflective of who they are, then they could have said, hey, we don't know what we're doing, or, hey, we're not, as good at this as we thought. This is really a reflection of our competency and what value we can bring to the organization. But instead of allowing that to defeat them and identifying with that blame, they moved on to do their own thing and to take another risk and not allow blame, that fear of blame to keep them from taking another risk, even in the same industry of home improvement. And they were able to be hugely successful. So from both sides of that coin, you can see where blame can hold us back and where we have to overcome it and in order to find our true success.
Get into that. Definitely got to find that true success indeed. And it's two great stories too. It's like, hey, and it shows great examples of really just taking some time to think as a leader, like instead of just blaming somebody else from the department, using them as a scapegoat. It's like, all right, cool, here you go, buddy. We're gonna have a 3 in the incinerator fire you, buddy. It's like, no, let's actually objectively look at the situation here and see what's going on with this darn account. It's like, oh, man, was over freaking worked. All right, let's get some more people. It's like, oh, we just had a lack of people problem. Now we got the abundance
Right.
factor happening here, and then it's like, oh yeah, these guys, I don't like them. We disagree. All right, keep going. Oh, they're multi-billion-dollar company now. Oh, I guess I probably should have thought that, but there was like, oh, yay, I can do what I want. Oh crap, they knew everything. Now I can't do anything.
Right, especially in today's workplace environment where it's so hard to attract talent and it's so hard to engage that talent in great work, and then it's so hard to retain that talent as well. So if we're struggling with attraction and we're engagement of talent and retention of that talent, then we have to address the toxicity in the workplace that is keeping people from doing that work. It makes it hard for you to bring people into a toxic workplace. It makes it hard for us to engage them in purposeful work, and then it makes it hard to keep people. That is the number one reason why people are leaving their jobs, is because of a toxic work environment. And we saw that during the pandemic too. It really highlighted this issue that during the pandemic, that then we had the great resignation, right? Where we had all these people leaving their jobs. And then whenever they were able to come back to the workplace, they said, no, thank you. I don't want to go back into that water that I was in before, right? I don't want to go into that toxic environment anymore. I'm going to opt out. Some people were like, I'm going to go somewhere else. And then some people were like, I'm just not going anywhere. I'm going into early retirement because the workplace is so toxic. And when they surveyed people to find out, during the Great Resignation, why were they leaving? Then their toxic workplaces, that was more than 10 times a bigger decision criteria for them than compensation, right? And so you think, well, we're not paying people enough, right? No, the bigger problem by 10x was toxic work environments. That's why it was making it so hard for people to keep the talent that they had in their workplace. So it's a huge issue for workplaces. It's a huge issue for employees. They're struggling with it. It's keeping them from finding a place where they feel like they can, find purpose and, feel fulfilled in the work that they're doing. And so, if we want to stop, job hopping, if we want to stop, having to, move from one place to another because of these toxic work environments, if we want to, stop having to, continually, recruit and retrain people because it's a revolving door in the workplace because of this toxicity, then we have to address what's creating it. And blame is a huge contributor to the toxicity in our workplaces.
So I'm talking about indeed, great point indeed, because yeah, you're so right. It's like, hey, so yeah, compensation is a thing. It's like, yeah, gotta freaking live. Dude. At the end of the day, it's like if you're gonna go the route of like trading hours for dollars, like I like to do, of course, still do it myself. But it's like, hey, if the workplace sucks, it's like, dude, you ready going in that place every day, your performance is gonna be down. It's like, then if it's so toxic to where you have to look over your shoulder sometime for some folks, then yeah, definitely don't want to be in that environment. Like that's really just bad for you.
drive home tired, just dreading the following day. And it's like, dude, like forget dreading it on Sunday night. You be dreading it every day.
Right. Yeah. Right. And people want to be someplace where they feel like they're valued and they feel like their leadership has their back. And they don't want to be someplace where, they're just, waiting for the axe to fall, right? There's an old story about how, during the industrial era, they had all these tenant buildings where, people, immigrants were working and they're helping kind of build the infrastructure in America during that time. But then they've got these small living spaces that they're in with thin walls and floors that were echoing and everything. And so the story was that at the end of a hard day, they're trying to rest and recoup for the next day. And the person, the tenant apartment above them gets home and sits down in their bed and they're getting ready to go to rest as well. And they take their shoes off and they just drop it on the floor, right? And say, so they've dropped that one shoe. And so then you're sitting there and you're like, oh, I'm trying to sleep. And this person, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? And so that's where we get that phrase. And that's the kind of situation that happens in the work. It's like you're living in that tension, just like I'm waiting for that other shoe to drop. And when we have a mistake or a failure that happens in the workplace, that's where that tension comes from, is that the employees are just waiting. They know that, okay, that first shoe is dropped, that mistake has happened, it's been revealed, we know it, but now they're waiting for the second shoe to drop, which is typically blame to be assigned to somebody. And that creates a high pressure environment, and it creates a situation where people are unable to really focus on doing great work during that time, because they're focused on who's going to get blamed for this. Is that going to fall on me? And are they going to point at me? Am I going to become that scapegoat in this situation? And so that's a common issue within the workplace where you've got an unhealthy culture, is that tension of waiting for the other shoe to drop creates a toxic environment for employees.
Sorry, dude. Don't want to end up like Payless shoes. That'll be all the shoes dropping in. Like,
you just hope that person has small feet.
Exactly. So my goodness, what's your been on part of your interviews promoting the good work that you're doing? What's a question that you wish folks would ask you more often, my man?
Question people would ask me more often. Probably not that question, because apparently I don't know the answer to that one. So yeah, so I mean, it kind of goes back to what we're saying about. I guess I would say that people would ask, "What is blame? What is it really?" They're not. That's a question that they're not asking at the time. But anytime that I answer it, they realize like it's something that a question they should have been asking from the beginning, right? It's like, if I've been throwing this term around a lot, if I feel like it's so essential to creating a responsible work environment, then why haven't I asked more about understanding what it is and understanding that term a little bit more, and how it comes into play, not just in the work environment, but personally as well, right? And so, like an example of where it's more personal, it's outside the workplace, is I don't know if you remember Harambe, the gorilla.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right.
Sad story, man. Oh, man.
Exactly. So, Cincinnati Zoo, many years ago, and there's a woman that was there, mom, and she had her kids, and one of her small children got away and slipped down into. He was able to go through a barricade and get down into the gorilla habitat, right? And so it creates a commotion, because the gorilla is definitely not safe for a small child to be around. So the crowd of people up above, they're looking down into the gorilla habitat. They start making a lot of ruckus, and Harambe is this large lowland silverback gorilla, endangered species, but a huge gorilla. And I don't know how much he weighed, but probably well over 500 pounds. Just very strong. and could have done serious, could easily kill a small child like that. But he sees the commotion and he kind of goes over to see what's going on, and he finds this small child over there. And then some people say that out of a sense of protection, that there's all this commotion going on with the zoo visitors, causing creating a crowd and creating that commotion, that he was trying to move the child to safety, but he grabbed him by the foot and started dragging him through this moat that's in the gorilla habitat. And so he's really close to this child. He's kind of hovering over him now, and he's kind of might have hurt him a little bit, dragging him through the gorilla habitat, even though he might have been trying to get him to safety. And so the zoo has to figure out, what do we do in this situation? And the only thing that they could land on, the solution that they found, was to shoot the gorilla and kill him in that moment. And so then there's a huge protest afterwards, that people are really upset, and they're like, well, why did you shoot the gorilla with a bullet? Why couldn't you use tranquilizers? And then even wildlife experts like Jack Hanna and Jane Goodall said, people that love these animals, and that's their whole career and life has been built around this. They said, no, the zoo made the right decision. That's what they needed to do, because using a tranquilizer, it could take 5 to 10 minutes to knock out a gorilla that size, and who knows what he would have done if he had been agitated by that tranquilizer dart. So they agreed that it was the right thing to do, but that still didn't quiet the critics. And some people were, okay, well, even if they don't want to blame the zoo, they're blaming the mom. And then the authorities came out and said, okay, there's this mom, she's got other kids with her, and if you think that you wouldn't have a problem with a child slipping off, or your attention wouldn't have been elsewhere at one moment or another, then you probably don't have small children, because that happens pretty much to every mom in these, and so this is just a really unfortunate circumstance. But people, there's a whole thing about justice for Harambe and all of these things. People are wanting to blame the zoos for having animals in the first place, but it's an educational opportunity, and they try to do everything they can to take care of these animals as well. And so just people were up in arms, and they still are. It's still a thing. There's still shirts being sold online, and justice for Harambe is still a thing. Here it is, like 10 years later. And so what is it about these that we feel like, hey, we know better than the zoo in this situation, we know better than this mom in this situation? The authorities come out, people on the side of animal experts, and you've got the authorities that investigated the situation, try to diffuse it and everything. And still, as individuals, we feel like, no, we know better, and we need somebody to blame in this situation. It creates this judgmental society that we live in, that wants to cast blame about, because we feel like there's some sense of injustice. And it's in studying all of this, I came across a lot of information from somebody, a French historian and sociologist, Rene Girard, who said that throughout history, all the way back to ancient societies, this is how we have been as a society, that we look for somebody to blame, and that it creates violence in our societies as well, like especially in societies that have a more primitive sense of justice, right? That if they don't have some sort of modern justice system, then what happens is the violence ends up being escalated, one group against another. And it's like it's almost like gang warfare, right? Where one group of people is violent toward the other group, and then they retaliate. Oh, you did that to me, now we're going to do this to you. And it keeps growing. And within these societies, that societal violence would just continue to escalate until the authorities would say, okay, whoever's in charge would basically take an innocent person, but within these societies, they didn't view it that way. They said, okay, everything, all these bad things that are happening in our society, it's because of this person over here, who is typically an outsider. Could have been somebody who was a traveler. It could have been somebody who was of low status in their society, somebody who's poor, a beggar, somebody who's diseased even, or it could be somebody that like they have a vocation that everybody looks down on, right? So it could be like a prostitute or something like that, somebody that's low in society, that they say, okay, all these bad things that are happening, it's because of this person over here, and society agrees on that. The community say, yes, they're at fault for this, we need to punish them in some way. And so they would cast them out, or they would even kill that person. They would remove them. They put all the blame, that all the violence basically that they were spreading across our society, they put the blame on this individual, they put the violence on them as well. And then that clears the deck, basically says, okay, now we're good. And it creates peace momentarily until that kind of tit for tat occurs again, and they have to do it all over again. And so that whole process, Rene Girard called that the scapegoat mechanism. And he said it's basically in every society going back, to ancient days. And you see that as something that's inherent in our societies, and it creates that toxicity, right? And then we have to find some sort of way to get rid of it. But it's not an effective solution because it doesn't solve the problem. It just releases the pressure instead. And so we're seeing the same thing happening in a more modern way. Like overall, when it comes to justice, we do have a justice system, but we're still looking for, within our workplaces, we still sometimes will feel like, okay, it's not a legal matter necessarily, but there is a sense of justice that needs to be restored. And we still look back to this primitive model for a way for us to solve it by using that scapegoat. And what I'm saying is, no, that's not an effective solution anymore. And we're creating more damage than we are doing good. And so how can we circumvent that instead? And so then within my book, I give some tools that we can use, like the blameless postmortem that we talked about earlier with Twilio. So there's a process for doing that. And then there are psychological tools that we can use as well. And so, we talked about that from a organizational level, from a leadership level, and from an individual level, what can we do? And a lot of times what ends up happening is what we struggle with as individuals. Sometimes we struggle with blaming others, and sometimes we struggle with blaming ourselves. And so one of the things I talk about is a tool that was shared by Henry Cloud, who's a renowned psychologist, wrote a book called Boundaries, right? That's well known. He also wrote a book called Boundaries for Leaders. And within that, he talks about how self-blame can take over in our lives, and what he calls the death spiral of a leader. And he talks about what he says are the 3 Ps. And it's that when after a failure, we see that it's personal, that it's because of me, it's something, a characteristic of myself has caused that failure, and that it's pervasive, and it's like everything that I do is a failure, and that it's permanent. And so everything I'm going to do is going to be a failure, right? And so those 3 Ps can create that death spiral, right? And so, and you can see blame is inherent in all those things as well. And so how do you overcome that? He said that you log those thoughts, and then you refute them. So write them down physically. What am I telling myself? Am I telling myself that this is personal, that this failure is because of a characteristic, of flaw in myself? Am I telling myself that the failure is pervasive, that it's everything that I do? Am I telling it that's permanent, that's always going to be that way? Write that down and then refute them, because he says those are lies that we're believing, because it's not personal. There's other attributes that are occurring, there's other situations that are occurring, there's other reasons why that failure has occurred, and we're not failing in everything. It's not pervasive, right? There are other areas in our life. If you're write it down, show how this is something that there are examples of areas in your life that you are successful, right? And then it's not pervasive. You can look back at when you failed in the past, and then you've encountered success later on, that it's a cycle. And so write that down, show yourself that this is not, your previous failures weren't permanent, So there's no reason to believe that this current failure that you're going through is going to be permanent as well. So there's tools that we can use for helping ourselves as leaders. There's tools that we can use for helping ourselves as individuals to overcome that blame and to not stew in the toxicity of blame, and to have healthier habits and to have a healthier culture as well.
So I'm talking about, indeed. Want that healthy culture, y'all. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. Want that six-pack culture, y'all. That's right, indeed. Indeed. Six-pack ab culture. You probably have to add ab in there. I feel with that. They'd be like, toxicity, like six-pack culture. Oh, I got a six-pack. I'm waiting for this toxicity.
Yeah. And there's things that so there's things that we can do. It's like, if we're gonna, do the crunches or the sit-ups or the leg raises or whatever it is that are going to create that six-pack, it's the same thing for having a healthier work culture or having healthier habits. And in fact, like that's one of the things that I talk about in the book as well is the definition of habit and the definition of culture and how similar they are. That basically a habit is individual behavior over time, right? That's all that a habit is. That you do something and you do it over a period of time that proves to be a habit. And then for an organization, what is culture? So culture is like, we kind of know what a habit is, but culture is a lot more vague of a term. We throw it is another thing, kind of like blame, right? That we throw it around a lot, but a lot of people have different definitions for it. But just like a habit is individual behavior over time, I like to say that culture is group behavior over time. So it's really just a habit in that group setting, right? And so as a leader, you can look at what are our habits as a group. What are the behaviors that we participate in as a group, then we've done it over time, right? And so if your habit is that after a failure you find a scapegoat, then you're creating that blame culture because of that. But if you can start to do these things where you're able to create clarity in your work environment and talk about what blame actually is, and that you can then give those definitions that give clarity for what blame is, what responsibility is, and what accountability is, then it helps to break that blame habit, because people start realizing, oh, okay, so we had this mistake happen, and are we just using blame in this? Are we using resentment in this situation? Are we scapegoating somebody in this situation? And so that awareness helps you to realize what you're doing and helps you to break those habits. And then if you've got some tools that you're able to use, like what we've talked about today, to help break those habits as well, then between the awareness and the tools, then you're able to have a healthier work environment, because those group behaviors over time become healthier as well.
Sounds good in the neighborhood, indeed, man. That's right, indeed. Break them down over time. So we're coming down to the magical question that every guest gets to receive. And that is, if it'll wake up tomorrow and you're at 25 again, but you're still in the current year, what advice would you give to yourself?
Yeah, so I think that I would tell myself to be more generous, right? That when you're 25 and you're kind of early in your career, you're just trying to think about, scratching and clawing your way into your career, and how can I make a name for myself? And the kind of the mentality of um, get all you can all you get, and then sit on the can, right? So how can we avoid that kind of mentality? And so be more generous, with your time and your passion. Be more generous with your grace as well. And that's a big part of what I talk about in the book, is grace, and how that is the greatest antidote, the greatest antitoxin that we need in the workplace. And understanding that it's not something that we have a limited supply of. It's abundant. It's something that we can continue to give. And the great thing about giving grace is that the more that you give, the more that there is, basically. So it's a renewable resource. So be
Yeah.
generous.
Love it. There we go. Being generous is a renewable resource. You'll love to see it, indeed. Love it. Probably one of the best ways I've heard about that, indeed. My man's been generous today with his expertise, and the good news is it's only probably 1% of the whole 100%. So for those who want to jump into the other 99 and keep up with all the stuff that you're doing, what's the best way for folks to do so, Dustin?
Yeah. So as far as my book and about talking about blame, I've got a website, blamethisbook.com. And you can always follow me on LinkedIn is probably the best place to follow me. And I share a lot of insight there on blame as well. And then as far as, how we take some of these things and apply it to your workplace culture and then help that reflect that in your marketing as well and your branding, because I believe that culture and branding are two sides of the same coin, then they can go to thepeoplebrand.com for that.
Sweet. That's what I'm talking about, indeed. Thepeoplebrand.com. That's right, indeed. You heard that right, folks. If you got some cows need a brand, he's got you covered, y'all. That's right, indeed. That's right, indeed. Remind him, hey, give him that good old branding. That's right, indeed. And of course, the regular branding these days, outside of the cowpoke branding, the real branding action. It's the people brand, not the cow brand.
Right. Exactly.
So, my goodness, man, any parting words before we close up shop?
Just the biggest thing for me is that, people understand that we don't need to blame, that blame creates resentment, and that, we can get beyond it at this point. So let's embrace grace instead. And I think that's something that can create healthier workplaces. It can help us to, get over a lot of the division that we're seeing in our society today and how we're polarized, in our politics and in our workplaces. I think it can help enhance, our civic society, what we're doing within our cities and in our government and within our churches and our nonprofit organizations everywhere, that we can become better by going beyond blame.
If you're hearing this part of the episode, that means you're one cool individual. Thanks a bunch for tuning in, and if you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to share it with at least one other person in your network. Bonus points for 3. And be sure to check out the backlog too while you're at it, because there are hundreds of wonderful episodes to choose from as well.